So yeah, I'm not coming really with any solutions, but I will describe a mechanism for group decision making based on people's favorite tools if you're here in the room. But yeah, what my goals are for this apparently hour-long talk, which is like an hour wink wink. So we have well, okay. So I'm in academia, so I'm hoping you'll get a sense of kind of how mechanism design people formalize these problems mathematically and think about them. So that might be useful. I don't know, the backgrounds in this room I'm sure vary widely, so I try not to assume too much. And the other thing I want to do is just kind of give some ways to stimulate thinking around how groups make decisions, and maybe we can have some good conversations about that. I hope there's time for those. So just interrupt me. You can raise your hand or just yell, and we can chat, answer questions, or discuss things as we go. And if I have to shorten stuff later, that's totally fine. Oh, and thanks. Yeah, so I want to thank Butter for inviting me, and of course the Uniswap Foundation, and all of you. Some of this work is supported by the Ethereum Foundation. And it's joint work with Mary Monroe, who's also at CU Boulder. Okay, but I'm mostly going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about our work too much because I want to tell you about or discuss with you generally decision making. So, okay, so we're talking about governance. It's a huge space. Within that huge space is still a huge space, but much more precise formal mechanisms for making a group decision. Okay, so what I mean by that is it's going to be a single shot problem, so we just have to make a decision together once. We want to have a very well-defined mechanism, which I think people here are very comfortable with that concept. An environment that might be low trust, so as opposed to like we sit around in a room and discuss for a while and decide on something, right? We need sort of well-defined rules for making a group decision. And of course, blockchain, you deal with this all the time. But I do want to emphasize, this is a very small piece of the governance space, and it's a very appealing one. I think as the previous speaker mentioned, because it has nice interfaces, and you can actually define mechanisms that work like this. But it doesn't mean that that's the most important problem to solve in governance. So I want to keep that perspective, but it is what I want to discuss today. Okay, so what I think is really interesting, and this is an idea that Hansen has kind of brought up first, I think, are two different paradigms for how we make decisions as a group. One paradigm is information aggregation. Okay, so the problem is we don't know what to do. We need to gather information and use that information to figure out what to do. Another paradigm is preference aggregation. Okay, some of us want some things, others of us want other things, and we have to come to a compromise, or we have to somehow make a decision with partially conflicting preferences. So I think of these as really different paradigms, and what I'm interested in and wanted to stimulate thought about is doing both at once in a formalized way. Okay, so information aggregation, just to expand on that a bit more, right? You can think of that as the discussing in a small group, right? We just come to a consensus about what to do, and we do it, right? Or you could imagine bigger, more formalized mechanisms for that. So some of the biggest ones, at least for aggregating information, are prediction markets. I'm assuming most people here have heard of them. I'll mention a bit more details about what those are. And there are other things that look similar, but in general, information here is formalized as predictions about the future. It's not obvious that you should do it that way. It's not the only way to think about information, but it's a very nice formalization of what information means is a formal prediction about what will happen in the future that we can later check how correct it was. Okay, so information can mean a lot more than that, but it's often hard to operationalize information in a different way than predictions about a future event that can be checked later. So that's often how we think about aggregating information. So in particular, we want to make a decision. Well, let's predict what that decision will cause to happen. Okay, and if we choose this one versus this one, we might predict different outcomes. And that's what it means to have information about the options. That's one way to think about the problem. Okay, well, what about decisions based on information? So the main one I want to discuss and that I know of are decision markets, which Robin introduced. There's plenty of other papers about decision markets since then. Most of you are familiar probably with Futarchy, and decision markets are the main component of it, but I'll redefine what they are. So let's suppose we all want to maximize some number v. So for example, it could be the value of our DAO's token, but it could be anything else that you can measure in 1 year. So we'll run a prediction market that says, if we adopt a proposal, what do we predict v to be? We'll run a separate prediction market simultaneously that says, if we choose not to adopt our proposal, what will v be in a year? Okay. So we have predictions for if we take the first option or if we take the second option. In this case, adopt the proposal or reject the proposal. Okay, so once those prediction markets have run for a while, we get predictions about what would happen in each world, and then we pick one of the worlds. Right? I'm sure this is familiar to everybody, almost everybody, but look, I'll just go through it. So for example, our mechanism for deciding could be, if the v yes is larger, then we say yes, we adopt the proposal. Now what you have to do in that case is you cancel all of the trades in the no market. Okay, so all those trades that people made, they all get their money back and nothing happens in that market. And then in 1 year, you find out the value of v yes, right? You adopt the proposal, things happen, v goes up or down, you find out v yes, and you use that to resolve the prediction market that you ran for the yes option. Okay, and then you pay out. So everyone's comfortable with this? All right, so I'm gonna come back and use this a bit more later. But okay, so I mean, there's not a lot of other formal mechanisms that I know of that are sort of a formal way for a group to use information aggregation to make a decision. Preference aggregation we'll talk about, that's a lot better studied. But a sort of formal mechanism that says we're going to aggregate information and decide based on the information, this is kind of one of the main ones that I know of, where you can really formalize it into rules that could be run on a blockchain, for instance.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
So I'm not sure I understood the paid out. What exactly is the flow value? Where does the weapon come from?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't say much about what a prediction market is, which is part of the answer to your question, I think. In a prediction market, people are buying and selling shares whose value will be related to this thing being predicted. The money has to come from somewhere, and I haven't talked about where it comes from to pay out for these shares. So often these markets are subsidized. We can talk about it a bit more later. But basically, if you think, for example, that if we adopt a proposal, V is going to go up, then you want to own shares of V yes. And so you'll buy a bunch of those shares because you think that if the proposal is adopted, those shares will become really valuable. And then the price of those shares will go up because lots of people are buying them. And that'll translate into a prediction that V yes is very good. And similarly, if you think adopting the proposal will be really bad for this thing, you would sell or short sell those shares and the V yes would go down, and we would end up ultimately deciding not to adopt the proposal. Now, and then there's this, your question might also be related to this canceling trades. So the way the decision market works is there are two options here: adopt the proposal, don't adopt it. So there are two prediction markets. One says, if we adopt the proposal, predict what will happen. If we don't adopt the proposal, predict what will happen. Well, we're only going to do one of those. We're either going to adopt the proposal or not. If we adopt it, we find out what happens, and we can pay out for all the trades in that prediction market, but we never find out what would have happened if we don't adopt. So we're going to take this market with all those trades, and we're going to cancel them all and give everybody their money back in this market. That's, maybe there are other ways to do it, but that's kind of the standard way to do this decision market. On the other hand, if we choose to reject the proposal, then we'll cancel all the trades in this market. We do find out, what will happen if we don't adopt, And so we only pay out for the trades in the other market. Yeah, so that's the structure of what's called a decision market, and I'll talk about Futarchy, which builds on that. Okay, so that was decisions based on information, and as I said, I think that's a lot less developed than decisions based on preferences, which of course goes back many, many years, even in academia, let alone in practice. And there are two main paradigms that I think about. One is voting. Okay, so ranked choice voting is the kind of standard for deciding as a group what to do based on our preferences. So if there are two options, you vote for one of them, and whichever one has the most votes is the thing that we do. If there are more than two options, you have all these ranked choice voting schemes that you may have heard of, and there's lots of criteria for which voting scheme you should use.
Isn't star voting considered best in class then?
I don't know what star voting is.
You should check it out.
All right. Can you describe, like, what's the idea?
Yeah, my understanding is that there was like a bunch of so people who specialize in these voting mechanisms, including people who like pioneered ranked choice voting. They came together for a conference and they took pieces and parts of different voting protocols and then came up with star voting. So I don't know the details, but apparently it overcomes some of the limitations of ranked choice.
Okay.
The acceptance thing.
I think.
These are the things that the options that are acceptable to people.
Yeah. I think I have heard something. Yeah, approval voting. Good. Yeah. So approval voting. Right. Sometimes ranked choice voting means something different to different people. I'm putting that kind of scheme in this general framework as well. In these frameworks, it's usually almost always one person, one vote. There's usually not quantitative measures, although stars, like sometimes you can say like, okay, I prefer this one a lot to these. So that's a slight variation, but it's still this general, like, for one thing, there's no money. You're not paying for what you want to happen. You're just saying everyone gets to say what they want. Maybe they're giving stars or they're giving a ranked order. And then we take what everyone said and we try to make a fair decision that aggregates their preferences. So that's a paradigm for group decision making by aggregating preferences. I'm not going to talk about that one much today, so I'm going to think about a much more quantitative utilitarian approach. But I think it's really important to talk about because that's the gold standard for democracy at the moment, for better or worse, hopefully for better, but there's obviously lots of problems with moving to something that's monetary or utilitarian, and this would address those problems. But I'm going to talk today about something that's very monetary and utilitarian. But as I said, like, I'm hoping that this talk stimulates you to think about different ways groups can make decisions, and that's a very important one. Someone might say not all mechanism design is utilitarian necessarily, but that's the broad brush stroke that I'm going to paint today. So let's talk about preference aggregation from a sort of mechanism design standpoint. So even a second price auction you can think about as a group decision mechanism. The decision we have to make is who gets an item, right? So we have a painting for sale, only one person in the room is going to get the painting, and everybody in the room is going to collaborate to make a decision about who should get this painting. And what the utilitarian framework would say is we should give the painting to the one person who will get the most value from it. Okay. And so now the question is, how do we all collaborate to figure out who would get the most value from the painting? It's pretty hard to do that with something like a voting scheme because everyone who likes the painting will vote like me. But it's a lot easier to do that with a monetary scheme because you can have monetary transfers. Okay, and so you can do something like a second price auction. So you have to assume that everyone attaches a sort of a number to the possible outcomes that could happen, right? So if I get the painting, my happiness level goes up by 100. If you get the painting, your happiness level goes up by 110. Okay, so everyone has a number in mind. And we try to maximize the sum of utilities. In this case, the sum of utilities is just it's the utility of the person who gets the painting. And we generally, to do mechanism design, we generally have to assume that this utility is interchangeable with money. That's called the quasi-linear utility assumption. So the idea is what 100 means is I'd be equally happy with the painting or $100. If your value is 110, you'd be equally happy with the painting or $110. Okay, and then the assumption is we should give it to the person whose value is 110 because that's higher than 100, and therefore total happiness is increased by the most. Now, of course, in the real world, people have different values for money because they have different endowments of money to begin with and different risk attitudes. And so this assumption is very problematic to actually apply. But like everyone else in mechanism design, I'm going to take this assumption and run with it. But it's very important to think about when you're trying to design mechanisms for groups. Okay, so the generalization of the second price auction many people have heard of is called VCG, Vickrey-Clark-Groves. And it generalizes this to group decision-making mechanism. I'm not going to describe it exactly, but you have a set of options. So for example, we're all at a city council meeting and we're trying to decide whether to use a space for a soccer field or tennis courts. Those are our two options. Well, you could imagine everybody has a value for the soccer field and a value for the tennis court, and we're going to run this mechanism that can involve money, or will involve money, to sort of auction decide, do we build the soccer field or do we build the tennis court? And so everyone will sort of put bids, and it's a very complicated, weird payment rules that I don't want to get into unless we have to. But it's a monetary mechanism for making a group decision that maximizes welfare in this model. So that's a paradigm for coming together as a group and making a decision and using money to sort of enforce what people say are their preferences. So there's what would happen if everyone was truthful, and then there's what would happen if everyone is strategic and tries to, so maybe they don't actually say what their actual value is, but they lie or misreport. So VCG has a Nash equilibrium in which people are truthful. So just like second price auction does. So the idea of the second price auction is that you should say truthfully what your number is, and if you win, you'll pay the second highest. And so you don't really, in theory, benefit from overstating or understating your number, because either way, if you win, you're going to pay the second highest. And if you lose, well, you're not willing to pay more than your number, so you'd prefer to lose rather than overbid and win. So these can work. People can be truthful in these. There can also be situations with where they fail, like due to strategic behavior as well, like bad equilibria. We're going to talk more about that in quadratic voting. So this project started from an inspiration of, can you have a formal mechanism that aggregates both preferences and information as part of one mechanism? So has that ever been done before? The main formal proposal I know of was Futarchy, which is Robin Hansen's idea. So first you vote, which is the preferences stage, on what you think is important. And basically you're voting on a way to measure your decision. For example, okay, with the soccer field and tennis court example, let's imagine that we're going to track how many people use this park over the course of the next year. And the thing we want to maximize is the number of people who use the park. So we can either build a tennis court or we can build a soccer field, and we want to maximize how many people use it. So we vote on number of people who use it. Now, we could have voted on some other way to measure how good this field is. So I don't know, like some blended measure of like how many children use it versus adults, or like how many locals versus tourists. Well,
How much noise each one creates.
Yeah. So you could have some much more complicated measure of success. But the idea of the preference.
Also paying for cost.
Yeah. So there could even be like a revenue idea in there, right? So we're charging excess. Yeah.
Don't pretty much all real institutions aggregate both preferences and information? I mean,
Yeah.
It's not in existence. Where does this ever exist? It's pretty much the usual case, right?
Yes.
They don't usually have nice formal models of them, but almost all real institutions aggregate both at the same time.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was curious about this. The word formal should be here. Yeah. So absolutely, it's every decision, right? Usually there's sort of a discussion and a vote. And you could ask, like, is there a benefit to having a formal information aggregation stage prior to the vote or not? But we're here to brainstorm. So what Futarchy does then is then run a decision market, and that's the information aggregation stage, based on deciding, right, so we talked about what the decision market does. You have a prediction market for each thing. So if we build the tennis court, how many people will use it? If we build the soccer field, how many people will use it? And then the decision market will pick for us the project that maximizes participation in this case.
Let me know if we're going to get to this later. Can you run this in a practical way? So if we have to do trade-offs between multiple dimensions that people care about?
Yeah, in theory you could. So for example, like first we're going to decide like whether it's going to be a sports field or a library, and then if it's a sports field, we want to decide. Is that?
I think more in terms of I want a reasonable balance between it's not too noisy at night, but it's actively used, right?
Yeah.
Two different dimensions that you want to maximize.
Okay. Right. So one thing you could do is try to define a measure that incorporates both, which is like just a linear combination or something. If you had two different dimensions, you would have to have a decision rule that, you know, for example, if the soccer field rates really high on use and really high on noise, and the tennis court is sort of medium on both, you have to define a boundary that sort of says
And
when.
I think there's a mechanism we think to define that boundary.
I don't know of one, but I think you could definitely come up with something. Yeah. So that's one proposal in this sphere, which is like a very formal mechanism that mixes both. I found just two other papers, pretty recent ones. I think for time, I'm not going to describe what they do. They're kind of papers in the format that my paper is, which is like a formal model, and then you try to prove stuff, and it's, you know, some specific and strong assumptions. So like here we have a bunch of participants, and they have signals, which is the information they have, and they're kind of IID, independently identically distributed signals. And then they have preferences about whether the proposal should happen or not. And it's kind of a wisdom of the crowd idea that they're doing here. So yeah, I mean, these are all models of life that with some accuracies and some inaccuracies, just like our paper is going to be. But it's a cool idea to check out. The concept of wisdom of the crowd is supposed to be that you can aggregate you can get much better information by aggregating a large group, even if they're not necessarily experts, than you can by just like asking somebody. So here, the application of wisdom of the crowd is kind of these people in general have, you know, rough information. Like each person has sort of a feeling that probably it's a good idea to do the proposal or bad. And when you can aggregate all that information, you can get good prediction about whether the proposal is a good idea or not. Yeah. By the way, there's a big tradition in voting theory. Like there's this idea of this Condorcet jury theorem, which sort of says, okay, if each person sort of independently kind of has a feeling of whether we should vote for A or B, then the overall majority vote is going to, with high probability, pick like the best candidate. And there have been, follow-ups on that kind of thing. So this idea of wisdom of the crowd and voting being connected is pretty old.
So one of the weaknesses of one wisest Condorcet is the private signal honesty. So when you think about that, it's how strong that assumption is, because we each have some kind of different source, and we're each getting this crucial thing. Is each getting something from only one source, because if you and I share a source, then it's no longer IID. And so in the real world, almost any kind of thing we can think of, this is not going to fly.
Yeah, so if you think about, like, if you and I watch the same TV channel for our politics news, and then this group of people watch the other TV channel, and this idea that like we're each independently evaluating the options is just not realistic.
Deliberate, this collapses.
Yeah.
I mean, because then we're sharing our signals. So this kind of model, it's hard to see like why you would model it this way. It doesn't, like, as far as having some kind of traction as a credible mechanism.
I think for me the reason it's hard to get it away from this is once you go away from this, I kind of think you have to go to prediction markets. Like, I don't really know what else.
Well, maybe we can prove we have to go to prediction markets to give me a great paper, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, right. Because, right, and prediction markets can overcome this issue. And then there's another recent paper that is motivated specifically by blockchain protocol governance. Yeah, it's kind of a very specific to the protocol update setting. I think for time and because I don't remember the details, I'm not going to talk too much about the details, but it's a reference you could look at that's in this sphere where there are people with both beliefs and preferences, and they're formally thinking about both of those at the same time, which I think is really cool. So let me tell you about what we did, and again, hopefully there'll be some general takeaways too, because our proposals in the end, we'll see, but I don't think it's practical yet. So first, I'll describe the public projects problem. Again, this is like a very formalized mechanism design way to think about the problem. So the model is we have a set of options, and we have to pick just one of the options. So the basic example is we have a proposal, and we can either pick adopt the proposal or don't adopt the proposal. You could have, okay, there's a field, and we can either build a tennis court or a swimming pool or a soccer field or all the other sports. Right, so there could be more than two options. There could be some number, but we have to pick exactly one. We were mentioning in discussion, this is a little different than the idea of funding, where you could pick multiple projects to fund, right, in a funding setting. So the public projects problem, as it's called, you have to pick exactly one of your set of options. Okay, just want to explain. In the model, as I mentioned with like the second price auction, each person is presumed to have a number which describes how much they want that option to happen, which is roughly their indifference between that option and a certain amount of money. So in this case, this person really likes adopting the proposal. They'd be less happy if we don't adopt the proposal. This person's pretty indifferent, and the final person really likes to not adopt, and they'd be only a little happy if we adopt the proposal. So, right, the utilitarian idea is that we define a mathematical social welfare and we try to maximize it. The definition of social welfare here, if we pick option K, it's the sum across all the people involved of their value if option K happens. That's VIK for person I. Right? So we just add up the total happiness if we adopt the proposal, and that's V for adopting. And the total happiness if we don't adopt the proposal is V for don't adopt. Okay, and then we have some mechanism which collects, in the public projects problem, it collects people's reports, it picks one of those alternatives to happen, and then it can assign payments. So VCG is an example of such a mechanism. It's like a very complicated one. Okay, and then the utility of person I is presumed to be the value they get for the thing we chose, minus any payment they had to make. Right? Okay. So that's just the quasi-linear utility assumption. Okay, and especially in computer science and game theory, we like to study this idea of price of anarchy, which says, what's the expected welfare of our mechanism, the value of the thing that we chose, K star, compared to the maximum possible welfare you could have gotten if you were a dictator who knew everything that was inside people's heads. Okay. And that's the ratio. So if you get 1, that means you always pick the best thing possible. And if it's like very small, then you did a bad job. So a lot of work in mechanism design, in my community at least, tries to prove in my mechanism the price of anarchy is close to 1. Actually, that's really hard to do. Even proving that it's larger than a constant is good, considered good in theory. And this has to be in equilibrium. So game theoretic equilibrium, which I'm not going to get into defining, people are acting strategically, right? So it's one thing to say, if only everyone was nice, welfare would be great. But we'll assume that, okay, people aren't necessarily adversarial, but they're not nice either. They're going to act in their own self-interest. Okay. So just for public projects, I haven't gotten to information aggregation yet. One thing you can do is the VCG mechanism. It has what's called a price of stability, one meaning there is that good equilibrium that maximizes welfare, but there are also bad equilibria where you get zero welfare. So it doesn't fare well by this price of anarchy definition. The idea of that is in the second price auction, imagine there's someone in the room who's bidding $1 million for the painting and everyone else is bidding zero. No one can really do anything about this situation unless you want to outbid the $1 million person. So they win the painting and they pay zero because the second highest, okay, it's not a very robust equilibrium, but in theory, that's why the second price auction can go wrong and VCG can go wrong.
You're taking a min over possible equilibrium here.
Yeah, so in this definition, it should really be min over equilibrium of the,
realistic equilibrium that wouldn't work for second price auction? Because like if everyone's bidding zero, like why would I just not bid one and they get the painting?
Oh, so there was one person bidding $1 million.
Right.
And so if you bid one, you still won't get the painting, but you can at least force that person to pay $1.
Oh, I see.
But then you have to worry like, okay, I could bid like 100,000 and force them to pay 100,000, but then if they drop down, I have to pay.
Yeah, is the million publicly visible or is it private?
It's usually private, but well, the idea of an equilibrium is we kind of know what, it's kind of that it's publicly visible.
Yeah, I think should be mixing the private-public assumptions. Because if it's private, then I would bid at least $1, because I don't know if somebody bid $1 million.
Yeah.
If it's public, then I would bid 999,000.
Right, yeah, so so it's complicated, and I don't have a more realistic version to mind, but we should definitely worry based on that version, based on that example, yeah. So one thing you can show is actually if you do something like an all-pay auction, you can at least get some price of anarchy guarantee. So basically what that means is every voter puts down an amount of money on each outcome, presumably more on the outcomes they want to happen, and they have to pay all that money, and the outcome with the most money put on it gets to happen. So for example, if the most money was placed on the soccer field, we'd build the soccer field. And you can at least show that has a price of anarchy. It's kind of a weird mechanism, but it's out there. And then there's quadratic voting, which in some conditions, this set of authors and some recent papers show that the price of anarchy kind of goes to 1 as the set of people grows large, basically, which is a really cool theoretical result. There are a lot of theoretical assumptions in that result, like the large assumption. Voters are IID, actually, I think, in most of that work, although my work relaxes that. But yeah, so this is based on quadratic voting, and I'm going to explain how it works. It's similar to quadratic voting, but it's a specific implementation. And we use it, so I want to describe how it works. Each person puts not an amount of money on each outcome, but a vote on each outcome. And you pay the sum of the squares of your votes. I'll do an example in a second. Okay, so you put 3 on an outcome, you're going to have to pay 9 for those 3 votes. You put 7 on an outcome, you're going to have to pay 49 for those 7 votes. It's squared. The amount you pay is squared. Then we add up the votes, and the one with the most votes doesn't quite win. It has a higher probability of winning. So only like a blockchain audience could be comfortable with the idea of a randomized outcome, but hopefully you are somewhat comfortable with it. The way this mechanism works is you pick the outcome from a distribution where the probability on outcome k is proportional to e to the number of votes for k. This is the proposal. I'll do an example in a second.
What's the motivation behind that?
I honestly don't know what the original motivation is, but I can tell you the math is really, really nice, and you can analyze this and show pretty amazing theorems.
Maybe that's the motivation.
Yeah, so strategic...
Every possibility actually happens in the outcome, so all strategic partners are considering all possible things with a finite probability because you make sure every possible thing happens.
Yeah, so strategic behavior gets really weird when there are cutoffs, right? So like if it's literally majority vote wins, you can imagine that right when you're at the boundary, like lots of people are trying to manipulate, like it's really, really worth it to me to vote a little bit more and pay a little bit more, because I go from not adopt the proposal to adopt the proposal just like that. Like I pay $1 more and boom. But everyone else is like, well, if I pay $1 more, I can go back to not adopt. So this just puts a little smoothing. And we're going to see that.
But why make it exponential? Like you could just do simple probabilities, right? Like that kind of my What's the motivation behind this? That
right. So you could do A over some of the A's. Yeah, it's just really nice mathematically, and it's also the probability will go to 1 very, very quickly as more votes are cast on. Like if there's a clear winner, the probability that you pick that winner with the most votes is going to be very, very close to 1.
But if somebody gets 70% of the votes, it'll have like 99% probability here. Okay.
Yeah, we're even going to see that in this example. Yeah, great point / question. So here's, just an example. So it turns out one thing we can actually prove is that in equilibrium, the sum of your votes is 0, meaning you cast some negative votes and you cast some positive votes. Now you pay the sum of the squares. Okay, so what in this example, this person is putting 5 votes on adopt the proposal and putting -5 votes on don't adopt. They're paying 25 plus 25, which is 50, to cast those votes. This person is putting 2 on adopt the proposal and putting -2 on don't adopt. They're paying 4 plus 4, which is not 16, which is 8. And so on. So now so that's how much they pay. You have to just pay for those regardless of what happens. And now what does happen?
But go back, that third person was doing a negative on the adopt instead of.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So the third person doesn't want the proposal to happen.
So they're vote for don't adopt instead of putting negative points on adopt.
Yeah, so it turns out you want to balance, basically you want to split your votes on positive on the things you want and negative on the things you don't in a way that balances. So it turns out we can prove in equilibrium people always act like this.
But the colors are
yeah, and the colors flip because these two people want the proposal to happen.
The two things are different things.
Sorry.
The blue, like the first voter, the blue and the red are on different proposals, different options. So
Yeah.
These are not on the same option.
Yes. So
there's only 2 here.
yeah, there's 2 choices. So let's say this is build something, and let's say this is don't build something. So this person wants us to build, so they're going to vote 5 votes for build, and they're going to put -5 votes for the don't build.
Don't build the other one.
Yeah, don't do anything. Like these are the 2 options that we're considering. And this person is saying, well, I don't want this proposal to go through. I'm going to put negative votes on the proposal, and I'm going to put positive votes on. Yeah, I should have used the soccer field tennis court example here. That would have been better. So now we add up the votes on each alternative. The adopt proposal had +5, +2, -4. And that's a net of, check my math, 3. The don't adopt option had a -5 and a -2 and a +4, and that added up to -3. And now we use our randomized coin flip mechanism. The probability that our mechanism will choose to adopt a proposal is e to the 3 divided by e to the 3 plus e to the -3. So that turns out to be 99.75% probability that we do adopt the proposal. And then the probability we don't adopt the proposal is like 0.25%. So we flip this coin and we do what the coin says. And because it's 6 votes ahead, it's very, very likely that we do adopt the proposal. So again, this is a version of quadratic voting with money. Okay, so we're assuming people are spending money for these votes. But the same mechanism will work if you have like 5 different options and the probabilities will sum to 1. Okay, so now with predictions. So yeah, we're getting close to the end, and I want to leave a little time for extra discussion, but I haven't described what we did yet.
You got more time.
Yeah, okay. So we wanted to have some scheme that incorporates predictions with decision making. We didn't say we necessarily wanted to use quadratic voting, but we had a proposal that was very similar, and when we found those papers on this mechanism I just described, we realized it was a really good fit for what we were trying to do. So we're going to modify that quadratic mechanism I just talked about to add a prediction phase. The things we're going to be predicting are what I'm calling the external welfare impact of each decision. So decisions have sort of two types of impacts in our model. There's an external welfare impact, and then there's the value from before. So the people voting have preferences. Like I like soccer, I want to vote for a soccer field. Like I'm going to be happy if there's a soccer field. But this BK is supposed to represent the value to the community outside of the voters, perhaps, right? Or so, for example, maybe the people on city council are voting, only those 11 people are voting. They might like soccer or tennis, but they're also going to run a study to see whether we predict the soccer field to be used more than the tennis court. And that's what the Bs are going to represent. So now the total welfare in our model is the value of the voters plus the external welfare impact. I don't think city council is the best example for this one. Maybe we can think of, the biggest example I like for these external welfare impacts are something like a carbon emission of a decision that we make. So let's say we have a DAO or we're a city and we're trying to decide, let's stick with city building soccer field or tennis court. We'll hold a vote for everyone in the city, but also those have different levels of carbon emissions, and that affects everyone else in the world besides our own city. So if maybe pouring concrete for the tennis court is much, much worse for the environment, then even if our own preference is our tennis court, it might cause a really bad welfare impact on the world to build a tennis court. This is a made-up example, I don't know the details. And so we might end up, even if the people in our city prefer the tennis court a little bit, once we incorporate the welfare impact of the decision, we might build the soccer field if it's close. Now, we don't necessarily know what these welfare impacts are, and so that's where the information incorporation is supposed to come in. Okay, and so why is this hard? What we're really interested in is the game theoretic aspect of this. So if you are trying to commission a study or in some way find out what the impact is going to be of your decision, this external impact, people who like the tennis court might want to manipulate the study or the prediction mechanism that predicts the impact of building a tennis court. And then you can even introduce incentives the other way, which is the people who participated in the study and provided predictions about the impact, they might want to manipulate your vote because then they'll get lots of payoffs for their predictions, for good predictions. So for example, if someone made lots of predictions about the tennis court, but we select the soccer field, they might not get paid for those predictions. So they make good predictions about the tennis court, and then they manipulate the vote so that the tennis court gets built, and then they get paid for their predictions. So that's the kind of strategic behavior we're worried about. Okay, so trying not to go any more long-winded than I already have. This is the general proposal, and it hopefully looks pretty simple based on what we've talked about already. We're running basically a decision market, run a prediction market for each alternative to predict these impacts, these external impacts. And then we're going to run our quadratic voting, quadratic transfers mechanism I talked about. And we're just going to add in some synthetic players that represent these external welfare impacts. So you can think of them as people whose values would be given by these numbers. It actually doesn't matter how many synthetic players. You can think of one synthetic player who these are their exact preferences, or you can think of dividing it up into thousands of people whose preferences add up to these numbers. And we can actually show it doesn't matter which way you think about it. The number of votes is the same. It has to do with how strategic behavior in the quadratic mechanism works. Basically, if you have a set of preferences, whether that's one person or a bunch, the best response votes add up to the same numbers. It's not obvious why.
You're assuming that we'll only ever know the external impact of the actually implemented policy.
Yeah, so we,
Otherwise, this would be easier, right?
right, so we're going to have to do a decision market thing. Yeah, so we run the mechanism. The mechanism picks randomly from this distribution, which is biased towards the things with most votes. And then once we pick that outcome, we implement it, we build the tennis court, we see, we maybe measure the exact carbon impact. By the way, that external welfare impact could also be like participation numbers as well. So predict, something like number of users minus number of tons of carbon. So we measure that and we use that to pay off the prediction market for tennis court. And just like with the decision market, we have to cancel all the markets for things that we didn't choose. And to actually make this work, we have to use what I call an importance-weighted payoff proposed in this paper. But as Robin mentioned earlier, it actually really helps us that this mechanism picks, like every option has a positive probability, even if it's really small, because that helps keep these markets honest. Because if you're trading in a market, well, the mechanism might pick that option and you might have to pay for those trades, even if the probability is really small. So that helps us prove that the incentives are good, which is a problem you can get in decision markets otherwise. Like you trade in some market and you don't worry about those trades because you know they're going to get canceled. Here, at least in theory, you don't know that they're going to get canceled, even if it's really small.
Exponentiation?
Yeah, so the probability could get really tiny because that exponentiation can really bias towards some outcomes, but at least it's not zero. The exponentiation is useful more for price of anarchy and welfare than it is for this, yeah.
Your importance weighted payoffs has an inverse for that probability, so all the options will have a large importance in decision making, even if they're very likely with that mechanism.
Yeah, so with what I have to do is, for the theory to work is, if the really small probability thing gets selected, you have to scale all the payoffs by a sort of corresponding factor, which is totally impractical. So, because like if it's a 0.01 probability of being selected, I have to scale things by 100 and so on. I have to scale payoffs. That makes the theory work. In practice, you wouldn't do that, but you would look at what you can do and the impact. This previous paper talked about is using the randomized rule, but I haven't seen it come up naturally before until we had this quadratic mechanism which picks randomly. Like before it was like, oh, we have to add a little bit of randomness for no good reason, but here the randomness kind of comes up. Okay, I'm getting close to more high-level discussion phase, just to get a sense of like, what do we do in like mechanism design math world? We prove theorems that look like this. They're not necessarily like that practically relevant. It just says, I'll tell you what these numbers are if you're curious, these t and epsilon. But basically t is roughly the number of people. And so as t gets really large, these things both go to 0, and the price of anarchy goes to 1. Again, price of anarchy is like the ratio of the welfare. So it's basically saying we can prove under some really strong assumptions that the optimal welfare is approaching 1. Epsilon is basically a liquidity parameter of the prediction market. And I can follow up, like send the papers on archive and stuff, but it turns out, right, okay, so what's, the manipulations you have to worry about from the prediction market have to do with how much money there is to be made by manipulating predictions. And that has to do with epsilon, which is, yeah, how liquid the prediction market is. But it turns out that even if it's sort of, as long as the number of participants is large, we're not too worried about that manipulation. We make this assumption, which I'm going to mention, yeah. So we can prove something good. This is like difficult to do, but it's still not fully satisfactory for some reasons I'm going to mention now. But it's some theoretical progress. Okay, so what's the main problem? The main problem is you can't do this. Well, you can implement it, but not necessarily in a credibly neutral way, because there were these synthetic players And you have to play on behalf of the synthetic players, and for that you have to do game theory. And for that you have to think about what other people are going to do. And it's hard to do that in a credibly neutral way as the mechanism to say, like, the synthetic players are going to do this. You have to compute the equilibrium and play it, and you don't have the information to do that. We have a proposed solution, and it looks like this. A1 was the total votes of the actual players, and B1 were those numbers that we got from the prediction markets. And P1 and P2 are, so this is like a fixed point problem where P1 is on the left and the right, and you try to solve this fixed point problem. It's not super important for today. It's our proposed solution, and the idea of this number, Vmax, is the maximum value of any one player, so it's some bound that we assume in advance. The idea of this format is it has to do with our calculations about the equilibrium of the game. So roughly what it is this is a scaling factor that kind of scales these numbers into votes. So we have this proposal, but we haven't analyzed it fully, and that's really all I wanted to say about it. The strategic, we think it should work because it's pretty much approximating what the synthetic players do in equilibrium, but the fixed point thing makes things hard. So that's still to do, still in progress work. Not what I wanted to focus on today, but just to give you a sense of what the problems are and potential solutions. Okay, but what's cool about this theorem? You know, it's not that I think like everyone should go out and run our mechanism yet, but I do think it's hopefully stimulating some ideas about how to incorporate decisions that incorporate predictions and preferences. And the theorem shows it's possible in theory without a conflict. And what's difficult to show there is if you're a voter, you would think that if you manipulate the market predictions, that can help you, right? So I really like tennis. I'm going to go in the prediction market and make a bunch of trades that propose that tennis is really bad and no one will play, or sorry, tennis is really good and everyone is going to play tennis. With some assumptions that are like basically you can't mislead people forever, we can show that doesn't really help because you basically just lose way more money trading in the market than you would gain as a tennis aficionado. And then you can also show kind of the opposite problem doesn't happen, at least with this inverse weighting idea. So if you put a bunch of bets in the tennis market and you think that if tennis happened, you would make tons of money on those bets, it's still not worth it to you to manipulate and cast lots of extra votes in order to make tennis win. But that does rely on this somewhat impractical, very impractical payment rule. But at least it's showing in theory that these are compatible. And that's what I think is interesting. Something important I want to talk about. Oh, this is kind of a nice fact. Prediction markets generally need to be funded. But you can use the payments from the quadratic voting to fund the prediction market after the fact, which is nice. If you have enough disagreement in the voting. So that's something we study. Okay, there's something interesting I want to say. I'm already I'm over time, even compensating for a late start. Okay, two things I guess I want to talk about before I stop. In our model, the voters had fixed preferences, so we tried to really separate the voter's preference and the thing the information is about. Actually, you would like to gather information so that you can change your preference, right? Like the information is going to help me know whether I prefer tennis or soccer or something like that, or whether I think it's a good idea. I think you could incorporate that into what we're doing, but it's certainly something that I think this would be a lot nicer if we had, but it's already hard to analyze this strategic behavior already. But this is something that we should be thinking about. The thing it let us avoid was we didn't have to worry about people being misled by prediction market manipulation. So I don't form a wrong belief about tennis based on the prediction markets and then change my preference. Like, I don't like tennis anymore because there was some vote that made it, or there's some prediction market prediction that made it look like tennis is really bad for the environment, and now I hate tennis. Like I didn't have to worry about that happening in my model. And you might worry about that in a real scenario. Okay. The other interesting thing, I think this is kind of, I realized this interpretation later, and this is something I really wanted to get to say, so sorry for taking extra time, but you could think about these external welfare impacts as like a component of the mission statement of your organization that's outside of the preferences of the people in the organization that are self-interested preferences. And I think that's actually super exciting to me, this question. So like one way I think about blockchain is the question of like, how does an organization avoid capture over time? Right? So how can you stick to a mission and organize as a group to make decisions in a way that those decisions don't get sort of captured? You know, so some small group gets to influence or make those decisions for their own benefit. Right, so you can have decisions whose benefits flow back to decision makers. And like in general, that's just how the world works. Like people have incentives for things to happen. And if they're part of an organization, their individual incentives don't go away when they're voting on what the organization should do. But it'd be nice if you can have your decision-making mechanisms not just incorporate what the people's preferences are, but actually like what the mission is. And so that's actually, this model is actually capturing that, and that's, I think, a really exciting like direction. So maybe we can discuss that. That's the end of the talk. Yeah. So maybe we can discuss that a little bit before we end if people have thoughts or comments.
Yeah, I guess the main thing that strikes me here, and I think you touched on it earlier, which is that whoever gets to determine the external welfare impacts, it's kind of like whoever has the spice rules the universe. And in this case, it's like if you want to game this thing, you put yourself as the person who's like measuring the external welfare or estimating them, and then everything else grows from there. So you just say tennis court is going to be so much bigger welfare impact.
Yeah, so you can hope that the prediction markets do their job, which we have some evidence that prediction markets are good at aggregating information and are hard to manipulate. Actually, I should have mentioned, you don't have to use prediction markets in this. The Bs could come from something else, but prediction markets we use because there's some guarantees that they aggregate information well.
It's the measuring part of it, because it's like something like carbon emission is tough to measure, but like how much happiness did people get out of that tennis court? Like we can all make predictions about it, but who does the measuring? Who counts the votes at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, and there's something I worry about with decision markets in general, because the other thing is you kind of have a whole year to try to manipulate that oracle before it makes its decision. Like everyone knows that for the next year, like we're going to be counting participation, and that number, whoever reports that number is going to affect a lot of people's payoffs. So it's a concern.
And if you can go back to the result, because intuitively it feels like there's something missing in the model, because
this
the
one.
price of anarchy goes up with
yeah.
epsilon going down.
Sorry. So as you get more people, it gets better. So epsilon liquidity parameter should be a measure of like how much money you can make in the market. And so if it's higher, yeah, I guess liquidity is higher. Yeah. I'm pretty sure, yeah. Right. And then T is a measure of how many people. And as you get more people, basically opportunities for manipulation go away, and sort of like these probabilities start really working out well as the votes get large, and so that's why the welfare goes to 1. Yeah, go ahead.
So you're worried about people manipulating the prediction market in order to influence the decisions made by the market's influencing. Yeah. I've always found it hard to worry about that when I think about large markets where each trader is a small impact.
Yeah.
Is there a reason? Am I wrong about something there, or?
I hope you're not wrong. Maybe I should rephrase. I'm worried about my ability to prove that it doesn't happen. That doesn't mean I'm worried about it happening in practice. But of course, another issue which we've talked about a bit in conversations is like, do you have enough subsidy and enough participation for these markets to function really well? So that's a question you have to answer.
And the subsidy is sort of like part of the, in your final slide, is like, the cash coming over that. Is it like the model doesn't work because there's a lot of something where that money sort of come from, but if you have sort of like a blockchain network and there's like a subsidy you've got, that's almost solved sport.
Yeah, so Yeah, and anytime you can subsidize a prediction market more, you can expect it to do better.
I mean, so the standard market microstructure models, as you're familiar, you could have a high concentration of information that only a few people really know about it. And so most other people are reluctant to trade against their information. But
Yes.
that, if there's any sort of systematic bias that they would be pushing in, the usual models is there's an enormous sea of people happy to jump in and correct any systematic biases that from their outside information they can say, well, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
So the question is, does that,
Yeah.
are there situations where with a limited concentration of information, you would be able to bias these relative probabilities? Because it seems like often those biases would be biases that would be caught by outsiders who would just know about the ex-ante distribution of these events without knowing the particular information. So that's why I find it hard to worry.
Yeah, so if I understand right, I guess one cause for worry is I haven't subsidized the market very much, or like there are only like 5 to 10
The
million.
fact that a decision is hanging on it is a subsidy of the market. That the temptation to manipulate is a subsidy of the market. It creates liquidity, and so.
Yeah. So, but it's a subsidy for people who care about the decision.
And for the other people who want to counter them. That's the point, right?
Yeah. So it could be, it could be that there's like dumb money that really cares about whether we build a tennis court or not, and there's so much of it that like some smart climate fund does some, or participation fund does a bunch of market research and then bets against them. The other, so hopefully that fixes itself. The other thing to worry about is that there's private information which is held only by people who care about the outcome, and that could be a real problem. So I'm having trouble thinking of an actual example, but if there's something terribly wrong with soccer fields, but I'm the only one who knows that, but I love soccer.
But say in one case you know a lot about soccer versus tennis in this community.
Yeah.
And there's only a few of you who know that, right?
Yeah.
But a bunch of outside speculators know very well about the distribution of soccer versus tennis in the country.
Yeah.
And there's these markets all across the country. So they can make sure the average across the country meets the average they know. They don't necessarily know in any one place, but manipulation, if it were consistently in any one direction, they would fix that.
Yeah.
If the manipulation is trying to go in soccer direction in this town and in tennis direction in the other town, they wouldn't be able to catch that.
Yeah. So I can't think of but you could imagine some decision that's just about our organization, and like only a very few people actually know some very important piece of information about it, but their preferences are biased the other way and they don't want to reveal that information in the betting market. That's the only failure mode I can think of, like in theory. But in practice, you probably don't worry about that.
How do you resolve the market at the end where you're making predictions over position?
Yeah, so the resolution at the end should look just like Futarchy and a decision market. So we've picked some oracle that's going to say, like,
Just need a measurable version.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Yes.
Great. Any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.